working on the zoning and planning code revisions for us. Just for her sake, we'd go around the room and introduce yourself so she knows who's here. Erica, you want to start?
Hi, I'm Erica Metzger. I live in New Philadelphia and I have a marketing company.
Okay. Tom Strickling, I live in New Philly. I'm on Zoning Board of Appeals.
Tom Simmelink, I'm with the Planning Commission.
Kelly Watson, Planning Commission.
Don Kemp, City Council President.
Dean Holland, Council at Large.
Cheryl Ramos, Ward 1 Council, and currently Chair of the Zoning Annexation Committee.
Jim?
Captain Jim Schultz, New Philadelphia Fire Department.
David?
Dave Hack, Zoning Commission.
Joel Day, Mayor?
Joshua Mathias, Code Administrator.
Okay.
All right. Well, we're just going to continue where we left off last time. And as a reminder, the kind of process that we're going through is this committee is going to be the first kind of line of review. And then I will make all the revisions we talked about, and then we'll start posting that, as kind of, okay, we've had one shot at this, put this out for the public. I mean, obviously this is public record anyway, we're not trying to hide anything, but we just want a chance to kind of go through and talk about, last time we talked about switching some roles and maybe adding some roles to the design review committee. So those are kind of policy changes we need to incorporate and putting it out there for the public. Anybody, I know that they're recording this meeting for those of the members of the review committee who can attend. If they have any comments following watching this video, we're going to have them direct comments to the mayor. When we post things online, or when the city posts things online, we'll kind of organize a way to funnel comments so that the city's able to collect all the comments and then just send those to me. I would prefer it that way so that the city knows what everybody's saying, rather than it coming to me. If anything comes to me, I'm just going to send it back to the city as kind of record. But just that's kind of the process we're going through. So we got through a couple of procedures last time I was here. I think we'll be able to make it through the rest of this. I want to start with where we left off last time, which was in the subdivisions. I think I noted at the end of the meeting that while the city currently has some subdivision standards, both in the planning and zoning ordinance, but also they have their kind of design standards outside of it, what isn't embedded in the ordinance is the actual process of subdividing. What is the process you go through? And that is pretty traditional. So what I've given the city in this draft form is kind of standard practice of communities like New Philadelphia. And we can adjust that as far as processes, is based on your experience through the major subdivision process in particular, but also what you just think might work best for the city. One of the things that I did was kind of split subdivisions into two different categories. One is a minor subdivision. So a minor subdivision is going to be a lot split, consolidation, boundary shifts between two properties, anything that results in the creation of less than 5 lots, including the original parent tract, does not have any public improvement, so no road widening, no road establishment, nothing like that. And essentially is just kind of more of an administrative thing. So this process would be approved by the zoning officer, the enforcement officer in this case, with some input from the engineering department, but it wouldn't necessarily have to go up to planning commission because again, it's just kind of checking to make sure lot areas are correct, lot widths, and that there's no public improvement. This goes in line with what is allowed by state law. This goes in line with common practice, so that was kind of where we started. So that's a minor subdivision, and you can see the applicability of it is creating that it shall not result in the creation or create more than 5 lots, including parent tract. Again, with things like shifting lot areas and the likes, we are not, if they're going to try to landlock or do anything unusual like that, there's still the authority to push it up to planning commission for a major subdivision. Process, like many of the other ones we talked about, they'll apply. It is reviewed. It will be be reviewed and sent out to the kind of departments, particularly engineering always likes to take a look at it to make sure there isn't any need for a public improvement, and then it would go to the code administrator. Yes?
Is there a definition of any public improvements?
Yes, so there are and will be definitions of public improvements, so any type of water, sewer line, any utility, I mean, obviously extending telephone service from the cable or the cable from the road to the house is not considered public improvement. But anything, creation of a road, the expansion of a road, any extension of water lines, sewer lines, any type of utilities. So basically, all they're doing is not making any change but putting a lot line or moving a lot line. And if it goes over, if they wanna create more than 5 lots, so if they've got a really large property and they wanna, you know, even if they're not creating any public move, you know, if they've got a big, long lot and they're just doing kind of 6 lots, it still has to go to the major subdivision. So there are cases where things will go to the planning commission, even though there's no public improvements involved. Once things go through the applicable agencies, then the code administrator can make a decision on that, minor subdivision. Once they make that decision, that's when they can take it to the county recorder and record it and the auditor. The review criteria is pretty basic. It's that they are meeting the basic requirements for lots in the zoning ordinance. Well, the error, I'll have to fix that hyperlink. All these blue things are hyperlinks that will work in the PDF and in the Word. I must not have whatever thing I'm going to reference there, or it's failed out. But if, for example, they want to do something where they're reducing the lot area or trying to reduce the lot width, they still have to get their variance approval before they move forward. So, you know, this is a pretty technical review. And then we do have a time limit. If the code administrator denies them, they have the right of appeal. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
The only, I didn't really put this in a question, I don't think here, the only option that might be in here is occasionally some communities like the city engineer to like sign off on the application as almost like confirmation that, yeah, there's no public improvements, there's no involvement in their kind of realm, and that they're okay with it. Others let that be just a informal comment from the engineering.
What do you think, Josh?
Do other cities ever have language in there about the streets? Like it seems like the process always goes, the developer will make the street and then the city will take over at a certain point. Or if it's a private drive, like, is there any language that signs off on that? Because every once in a while we'll hit into something like, who takes care of this road and that kind of thing.
So the major subdivision process gets into, if they're trying to build a public road that they want the city to maintain, then they have to go through the major subdivision process. There is no alternative. And I've seen this happen, if they, let's say they got a big tract and they're gonna split it into 5 and they wanna do like a shared driveway, they may call it a private road, they could call it a driveway, but that's not, if they're not seeking that to be taken over by the city, that would just be considered kind of a driveway or a kind of a general site improvement. And I do see that occasionally where they'll have like a shared driveway that goes off.
Some of those are called, what the city calls the dedicated drive.
Yeah.
There is a definition out there for us for a dedicated drive.
Yeah.
Plat, has to be platted.
But then who does maintain that though, when it's a minor subdivision?
There's typically a maintenance agreement that the landowners are responsible for. The city owns nothing of that. Normally the land is owned by, however it's divided, by those 5 people.
Yeah, a lot of times it's duplexes or something.
Yeah.
Put in street and then.
But it's not a street, it's a private road.
Right, yeah.
Private street.
We'll have a discussion when we get to PUDs and when we get to subdivision standards about private streets.
Okay.
And it's been an interesting discussion I've had because every community is a little different. I have some communities that say, we're just not even gonna allow this. Like you can do a dedicated drive for maybe 4 people or something like that. But anything over that, we're not doing private streets, because lo and behold, 10 years down the way, you're gonna be like, oh, I thought the city took care of it.
Yeah,
No.
we've got that
And then they
situation
complain, like, you know, and so I've had some communities that outright prohibit them. I have some communities that say, you can do a private street or dedicated, you know, whatever you wanna call it, but it can't be more than 10 units or 5 units or something like that. So there's a little bit of give, right?
Ours is 5 lots.
You know, and so you can do that, but, you know, sometimes they even make them record a note with the deeds that says this is not public, this is not maintained by the public, you've been warned. I only recently came across one city who the developer lobbied hard enough, because they were like, oh, we want a free-for-all, and they had like multifamily and all kinds, and I was like, ooh, that's no, that made me very uncomfortable, but they got it. And part of that, I think, was really related to the street requirements. Like, that city was really requiring very wide right-of-ways, and the developers weren't really high on that for some of their lots, and instead of going the route of variance or subdivision modification, they just lobbied to be allowed to do pretty much a free-for-all on private streets. I think in 20 years, they're gonna get a lot of complaints.
We mimicked ours off of what county does for a dedicated private drive. It's gotta be 50 feet wide, and the people own that property. There's a maintenance agreement, it's gotta get recorded with it. There's a plat that's gotta go with it. So that plat and everything says who owns this. And when we do the major subdivisions, you know, nowadays the parcel, the street is a separate parcel. And when that plat gets recorded, that street goes from the developer's name or whoever to the city of New Philadelphia. There's a bond out there to get that street done, and then once the bond is, once the street's done, then that bond gets released and we actually own the property.
So that's what gets into the major subdivision. We have that process of bonding before you construct, and then,
Because
inspections.
we had one at county, because that's where I came from, we had one at county that was that way, that did not get finished, and they ended up using the bond money to finish because they didn't do the curbs and gutters right.
Yeah, yeah. No, we still have all of that, we'll still have all of that requirement, but, so I think this will be, the whole dedicated drive and all that's gonna be a discussion that will continue into the subdivision standards.
While we're in there, is there somewhere in there that states like splits, combines, any changes in parcel lines must go through us before it goes to county?
Well, so that's, the order it is it has to get approval from the code administrator first before it can go to be recorded.
Okay.
So that's why the step 4 is the recording of this.
Okay. Because I know right now, the county has not required combines of parcels to come here.
So,
And we
I mean,
want-
that's gonna be a discussion to have. I still think it's a good idea for combinations,
Yes.
because they could combine something that still doesn't meet the lot area, there's all kinds of,
Well, they can combine ones that are 2 different zones.
yeah.
And then that causes a problem, because now you got one parcel that's got 2 different zones on it that causes problems.
Yeah.
We prefer to keep that a 1-to-1 relationship. Makes it easier to map.
Yeah. Well, and that's good to know, because that, in the next chapter you
But
get, will be about the zoning map, and usually one of the rules I'm seeing communities go for is the boundaries of districts, any new ones. I mean, you might have some existing ones that are a little quirky, but, beyond any like floodway overlay or something like that that's controlled by a natural event, that it follows, center lines, it follows lot lines, it follows.
What I'm looking for is that verbiage in there, so then I can send that to county, say, here, all of these need to come through us.
Yeah, and in fact, step 4, you can't really see it, well, except if you look at your computer. If the application is approved, then they'll sign and date all the required Ds and
Right.
minors of it.
Okay, thank you.
The funny thing is, I'm usually not on the other side of applying this, but I actually, in my county, had to go through a minor lot split or a minor subdivision, and it was still complicated. I felt like, man, what? It had to go, I was in a township, but it had to go through like every agency. I'm like, there's no, it's just literally a slot. There's no septic, there's nothing.
That's why at county, we always say, go to a title company, because they do it every day.
Yeah. Well, and that moves us to the big ones, the major subdivisions. So this is basically anything that doesn't qualify for minor is gonna go to a major. So again, Sometimes, you will have things that have no public improvements, but if it's got more than the 5 lots, it's still gonna go through this major subdivision process. One of the other things is that, this could also be reviewed if a large development goes in where they don't need a subdivision, but they have to send a sewer line across it or send a water line across their property, and there's some kind of public improvement that happens with just development. There'll be a cross-reference back to this review process where they still are going to have to go through planning commission, have it dedicated to council, have it reviewed by, all of that will happen. So some of this process applies even though there's actually not a split in a lot. So the major subdivision process is a little bit lengthier. We're offering the pre-application meeting. A lot of times, especially with larger subdivisions, they like to come talk to staff or the planning commission. They will file for a preliminary plat. They go through administrative staff review, so this is the first time like departments will get to see it and take a look at it and comment on it. The planning commission, who is usually the ones charged with all the subdivision review, will get to review and make a decision on that. And so this is where they're saying yes to the lot layout, the street layout, all of that type of kind of general information so that they can determine that it generally meets the requirements of the zoning district, it meets the requirements of the layouts, the general design criteria for subdivisions. After that, they submit improvement plans and the final plat. So the improvement plans are the technical engineering specs that showcase that they meet the design criteria for streets in the city, the design criteria for sewer, water. If you've got any public utilities or private utilities, you'll have to go through that and get all of those kind of approvals. The final plat then takes all of that into account and is essentially what eventually will get recorded if they're good upon that. Administrative review, again, it goes through a round of review. The construction improvements, this is where they have the option of bonding, which is usually what they do. Or some, if it's a small improvement, they'll just go ahead and put it in. Then it gets kind of inspected and follows all that before there is a final decision on the final plat. So everything has to be in shape, bonded, and all the lights before it can go to the county for recordation. And actually, even before that, the city council will have the opportunity to review the public improvements and determine acceptance of those public improvements, and that's when they turn over into the cities. So we're gonna have the bonding requirements and everything like that. The only thing, and I put this in here and I didn't put a question in, the only thing I'm seeing as far as improvement plans versus the final plat is sometimes a community that has the engineer that's doing a review will put in there that the improvement plans are approved by the engineer, because you could have civil engineers on your planning commission, but for the most part, planning commission's gonna be relying on the engineer to say, yeah, they meet the depth and the design standards for all these public improvements. So in theory here, we have it written where planning commission would be listening and saying, you're fine, okay, we can approve it. But sometimes we actually just make that a separate step, that first you get improvement plans approved by the city engineer, and that's when you can bond and start in construction. And then planning commission comes in to kind of review the final plat upon all of that. So that's kind of up to you and where you feel the comfort level is in the decision-making process, but that's just one of the variations I've seen out there.
Yeah, well, the way our process works now, it's the service director would consult one of our engineering firms that we use.
Yeah.
So we don't have an engineer on staff.
So they consult them and they give you back the information?
The service director would report that, yeah.
Okay, so in this case, then ultimately it would be the planning commission saying, yeah, you're fine, let's
Yes.
proceed, okay.
Right, because the commission would rely on what they're told by the service director.
Okay, well, and we have this, like we said, and I can eliminate the city engineer, and just kind of, we define city engineer as either a staff-on person or could be consultant, because that's not uncommon as well.
Right.
Whoever's representing you from an engineering standpoint. But this step 6 administrative staff review would be essentially the process you're talking about now. They
Right.
send it out to, it's not just the engineer that's looking at this, so. Any questions on that? Then once all of that's done, then it goes to the county for the final recording. They cannot sell those lots until that's been actually recorded, and we make that abundantly clear. The review oh, go ahead.
Who records that? Does the city record that, or does the developer record
The
that?
developer usually is responsible for recording it. In fact, we even say if it expires within 120 days after council approves it, so they're on a deadline to get that to the county. And usually they're at this point ready to go, and so they're right there the next day.
Sometimes.
Sometimes. The review criteria for this is essentially looking at, does it comply with the preliminary plat, that they haven't done anything weird. We do give a little leniency that if there's a minor, change, they shifted just a couple inches or something, some water line or sewer line or whatever, that could be approved just internally. But, if they have a final plat that shows an entirely different street layout, then they're not going to get approved. That any of the review agencies that have jurisdiction don't have any objections to it. I'm sure there's multiple non-city agencies that have to take a look at some of these, so that's all of it. The amendments, this is where we give some minor leeway. If there's some technical aspect that doesn't change the substantive plans, then they're allowed to go. Subdivision modifications, this is allowed by the state, and it's something that most communities allow, but they call it a variance, but then they say, well, planning commission can review it. And so instead, we call this something slightly different called a subdivision modification. So this is where an applicant wants to change something in the technical design standards of subdivisions in the subdivision chapter we're gonna have. If they want a narrower road, if they want different pavement, then require any of that type of thing, that is something that the planning commission would be allowed to look at. Now, if they want to change lot sizes and zoning elements, then they have to go to the BZA. But this is one where they would still have to hold a public hearing, but it would be in front of the planning commission. And again, it's specific to the subdivision design standards. So this is something, and in fact, the term modification is used because that's what state law kind of talks about, is that planning commission can modify those standards. So that's the term we use here. It's just trying to make the difference between when you go to the BZA for a variance versus when can you get a modification by the planning commission. It doesn't happen quite often. The most often we might see it is areas where there's some tricky topography and the street kind of requirements don't necessarily work real well, but some other alternative would. Again, that's where you get the kind of practical difficulty. Thoughts or questions on that?
No?
All right. This may be a question for you. So one of the questions I have about appeals of any planning commission decision on subdivision. So let's say they deny the preliminary plat where the planning commission's made the decision. One of the questions I had is whether or not you would want that kind of decision to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals and allow the city's board to take one more look at it, or whether you'd just rather them punt them straight to court.
Thoughts?
And if you're looking for me to tell you what you should do, I'll tell you, I see it go both ways. And the reason being is this. Some people prefer to go to court because that's like a hoop that or like, you know what, if they gave us a good enough reason, we're not even gonna try to mess with the courts. But I have other communities who would prefer that if there is a first kind of level of review, they'd rather it be the city who has the city's kind of interest at heart. So they would go to the BZA and have that, because then the automatic appeal of BZA goes to the court. So it's just, it's adding a level that looks at the it's kind of embedded in the city first, so.
So what happens if planning commission denies it and they appeal to the board, the BZA, and they approve it? Then you got one, what happens there?
Well,
BZA's
so
got one.
that's always a risk with anything like that, but if the BZA approves it, then it would be allowed. Now, the city, if the city planning commission or something, they could argue that, the city should try to appeal that to the courts. They still, it still could go to the courts. The BZA, and this is where good training comes into play, the BZA's gotta have good reason to overturn that. So the planning commission would have had to made some kind of blatant error. Hopefully, not because the developer was like, poor me, they were just being hard on me, but, they did hold us to the fire. That's not the reason to overturn a decision. They have to find that there was an error in the decision.
I know all of our other committees and boards, if there's an appeal, it usually goes straight to court then, whether that's housing, international property maintenance code, board of zoning appeals, I mean.
Well, and again, that gets back to, the whole thought process behind, appeals, and, there is something to be said that the courts, because they're not involved in this, are going to tend to kind of keep out of what I call committees of compassion. The whole compassionate argument goes away. And so as long as the city is maintaining good records of like why they made a decision, the courts actually give benefit of the doubt. In my mind, from what I've seen, the courts give the city the benefit of the doubt. It's when you don't keep a good record of why you made a decision that you could be in trouble. So I have it written as going to the courts because that's probably the majority of the way I see it going, but I always put it out there as an option.
I prefer going to the courts. I don't like it two equal boards, one being able to overrule the other. I don't like that.
Okay. All right, certificate of appropriateness. So right now, this is written this is drawn from your language in chapter 13 regarding downtown design review. As a reminder, when we were talking last time, we're going to expand the role of the review board, the design review board, to potentially in the future be able to hop in and do historic preservation if you ever have designated historic districts. The good news is the COA process here reflects, what you do now, but also would be reflective of a typical certificate of appropriateness for a historic review. So you kind of already have this procedure in play that could be used if you ever do historic districts. I'm gonna have to tweak the language already a little bit just to make sure that, if you ever do create local historic districts, that you don't have to go in and tweak the language, that we open up the ability even though you don't have them now. So again, this is based on kind of the language that you use right now. So anybody who's doing any kind of exterior construction or demolition of a structure that exceeds 200 square feet, they have to come in. Site improvements such as parking lots, landscaping, and other site work that aren't specifically identified in the design review, or that are, they would have to go through it. That's my understanding, is pretty much anything they do in downtown goes through here, goes through the design review. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, right now, it's just signage, and the holdup or the hesitation has been, there's no enforcement, ability to enforce. Certificate of appropriateness, I question, why do you even have that if you're gonna have standards on facade improvements for downtown?
You don't have to call it a certificate of appropriateness. If you ever have historic, that's the kind of terminology that is used, and that's probably where it got pulled into yours.
Yeah.
I will say, outside of that, if there's a difference between standards and guidelines. So standards are, you shall do this, And any person who can reasonably read that and say the answer is either yes or no, then you're right. That's a standard that even staff should be able to administer and enforce. Guidelines are something where you tend to want to have a board review it, and there tends to be some discretionary review. So there's guidelines, and there's information that would help them make a decision, but it's not usually an absolutely yes or no answer. There's a little bit of discretion in how they meet that. So you will see a lot of even downtown non-historic kind of design review have guidelines that says this is kind of what we're trying to achieve. I don't know if I have anything on my thumb drive that would kind of look at that. You know, and they could talk about the characteristic of adjacent buildings. So you're trying to keep the rhythm of the window height the same as adjacent buildings. Well, rhythm, you know, that there's enough guidance that you can understand what they're trying to do, and usually with graphics this helps. But there's still a little bit of discretion, and that's not a clear yes and no.
Yeah.
So that's where, you know, design review boards come into play typically as they're looking at the discretion. Some communities do that through their planning commission, so they don't have a separate design review board. So there's all kinds of variations in that, and even with the historic preservation, some communities like Sharonville, when I worked with them, they used to have an architecture review board, and they just put it all in. They just put it all into the planning commission, but they had like 4 sites that were historic, so it wasn't a huge burden. So there's a little bit of that. One of the things we haven't gotten into, and so we can always revisit this, is what are going to be the standards we're gonna apply to downtown. And that may be, you know, that may be where we say, oh, those are all kind of very clear standards. Do we really need to do this process? And then that brings in the question of what's the design review board for?
Yeah. Erica, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think it's been the struggle the entire time, kind of figuring out how to handle what that is going to look like for that entire process. And the challenges, of course, are the different levels of how it is set up compared to what we hope to get out of that. As I'm thinking it through, you know, right now, all we have are guidelines at this point.
Yeah.
And so I know that we're hoping to make it more of a standard in some way. And we're still working through that part.
Yeah, we'll need some direction, Wendy, and, you know, to look at how other communities have handled that.
Yeah, well, that's gonna be a discussion in itself because,
Yeah.
and I think I'd mentioned this at our first meeting. When you talk about anything from signs to architectural standards to historic preservation to all the pretty picture stuff in planning and zoning, you have to think of it as kind of like a gauge. And so there's doing nothing to absolute control. Legal control, absolute legal control. And I've worked with communities that want, like, they control the colors of everything, and you probably like Dublin, and some of those are very restrictive on things, and there are other ones who don't want to do anything. Most fall somewhere in between. So that's where we will be having discussions, and I'll be like this. That's why the benefit of this review committee first is, you know, I can take what I've heard so far, kind of put something out there and say, let's start with this, and then let's adjust it. And it's just trying to, oh, this is wrong lap. I'm like, what? I'm like, why isn't my desktop showing the file I'm looking for? It's not my computer. Let me. I need to do some work on cleaning up my, this. So, I'll pull up another zoning ordinance I've worked on. This is Logan, West Virginia. They actually don't have zoning right now. So this will be a real interesting process. But one of the things they want to do without historic preservation is have some downtown design standards. And so, you know, this is the kind of stuff they have, you know, and it's going to their planning commission for review because there is discretion in here. There is no COA. It's just a site plan review.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of graphics, and this is where they're just trying to focus on maintaining like rhythm and character and stuff like that.
I like
it kind of takes some general practice historic preservation approach and says, how can we, I don't want to dumb it down, but how can we make that a little bit more practical in this situation where they don't want to get into historic preservation level, like review, where we're looking at the contribution of the building and, you know, that type of thing. I think this is like 2 pages, you know, new construction. Again, the graphics trying to show what we mean when we're talking about like the continuity and stuff like that. You know, there are other examples out there where, especially with demolition of buildings, they want a little bit stronger standards so
Yeah,
that.
that would be, I think, really important. I like the discretion side of it, and there's been many reasons why that is helpful to what we would want to do there. And then the other part of it too is, you know, just, we are still in that strange spot of what's a guideline, what's a standard. But we have looked at some situations with the historical side of it where we can see with just some of, some more, you know, tighter suggestions, tighter control, whether it's a standard, that the design that that business or that owner had taken for that property or building, they could have kept some of the historical value with it with just some minor changes and some minor tweaks to what they were currently doing. And so that's something that would be, you know, that between being super historical, but yet keeping it right there where it's like also practical in the sense of we don't expect somebody to do certain types of modifications to make their signage work or to, you know, be completely ridiculous about it.
Yeah.
Is there consideration for colors of signage? One of our newer businesses right in the historic area, close to the Methodist Church, has a huge bright yellow sign, you know, and that is not contiguous with the buildings around it. It's not pretty. I'll just be nice and say it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, in any downtown area, can you limit the colors that are used? You know, do you want bright purple flashing lights in a historic downtown?
Yeah, let me give you a little bit of a primer on historic preservation and the terminology, because when you say historic preservation, some people think, oh, that's the national rules, some people think, oh, that's like the really strong stuff. And the reality is, it really kind of depends on what you all want to do. And it doesn't have to be called historic preservation, so, you know, we do conservation, you know, we do all kinds of terminology and stuff like that. So there are national districts and national sites that are, you tend to use the National Secretary of the Interior standards, which don't have a lot of teeth, but, you know, they're out there and people have a lot of pride in them. There are local districts where, you know, one of the things we talked about is we could insert a process by which in the future, if the city wanted to actually create their own local historic district or identify local historic sites, at least you would have that information to be able in like 10 years or whatever years they want to do it if you want to take it that step. What that does with the local stuff is if you do certain things, if you kind of go more historic and you meet some of the state historic preservation office kind of requirements, you might open yourself and the property owners up to some funding opportunities for like grant improvements and facade improvements. But that doesn't mean you have to do that. So you could also do something lesser where you say, no, for us, this is a local historic district. We're not so worried about what the state's saying that means, but we're going to kind of create this, you know, special preservation area and district. Even if you don't do that, you still can set special standards like you have for now for downtown. My point in that is just explaining you have so many options. But even within that, yes, to a limit, you can regulate color. I say to a limit because there are situations where my understanding is trademark laws would protect, like Starbucks. You can't say, well, we know you have a green symbol, but we're going to make you do brown. That you are going to fall into some problems with. However, anything else like that, yeah, I see a lot of communities who say no neon. There's some discretion in that. And you have to be careful at how you write those. because, there are some instances where if you just said no yellow, well, yellow has a billion hues, and a light yellow might be appropriate, but a bright yellow might be not. So you have to give, again, enough guidance to give the review board the kind of guidance they need to make a defensible decision. A lot of communities don't have done, there are communities that have done this, that don't want to do this. There are communities that go to the level that color is such an issue. They have a palette by which they say, this is appropriate, this is not. Anything else, you have to get a variance. And there are historic palettes out there, but I think that's one that takes a lot more study of what's traditional here to be able to kind of say, we are comfortable that this is what fits New Philadelphia. So that's a long answer saying, yeah, you can, but you gotta be careful.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, oh, first and then, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, well, about that sign, I know which one you're talking about. But with the downtown and we wanna preserve the historic, you said you guys are working on standards. So you could, put in those standards like size and style.
Oh, yeah, I
And
mean,
not touch color.
yes. So, I mean, that's for any sign. I mean, we
Yeah.
certainly, when we have the
Okay.
sign regulations, we're gonna be talking about what type of sign it is, structurally, what, you know, where can it be located? Especially on like historic, even like, again, not historic districts, just historic areas. There are opinions about projecting signs and where those can be hung and how high can they be hung, you know. Projecting signs are supposed to be very visible to the pedestrians, so most communities want them on the first floor. You know, there's all kinds of things like that, but 100%, you know, you can stay away from color, you can have some general guidance for color, or you can like be downright very specific about it.
The city of Frankenmuth, Michigan,
Yeah.
the Bavarian
Mm-hmm.
design, they have specifically designed not only, or created the design for the buildings, but they've also created the color restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain colors that are totally prohibited there. And I'm just wondering if we can't at least look at some of their design criteria that perhaps could be incorporated to eliminate these kinds of things that, you know, this gosh awful sign
Yeah.
situation.
So, again, it kind of goes back to the answer is, yeah, I mean, you can do anything like that. I know, I'm familiar with their example, but there's also a lot of other communities that have very, very stringent rules and kind of very clearly dictate architectural style. Like, there, it's gonna be like all Tudor and stuff like that. There are other communities that do that say it's gonna be all one or two particular styles, because that's what's there. I see that a lot in historic residential districts where there's a protection of a very specific architectural style. So certainly, you know, there are plenty of examples out there of controlling design, controlling color. There are some communities that are very specific about materials. So I worked with one where they said every projecting sign has to be actual wood. You can't even do the fake composites. There's just so many variations that, you know, you can kind of put into play there. It sounds like we're gonna have a big meeting about downtown and like what we wanna do.
Oh,
which is
yeah.
fine.
Well, even with all that being said, we still, our design board is still just a suggestion. So like, we could give them all the suggestions in the world at this point and they'd still could roll out with that sign and put it up there however they would like.
Well, so you may feel like it's, you know, right now, it's just a suggestion. And there are communities that, I've worked with communities that have architectural review boards for, I can't even believe I can say, every time I was talk to them, I was just like, are you really doing this? But that's what they did. They had architectural review board of every single, even single family home. But it was a suggestion. And so they would review it and they would give their suggestion. But if the applicant waited 60 days, they could do whatever they wanted. So that is very advisory. This is written to give the design review board a little bit more teeth, but it still would be appealable and it's still discretionary. But the thought process I had when doing that was the fact that you would have more guidance. You know, it wouldn't just be kind of, kind of out there with trying to determine what it is. There would be, even if they are guidelines, there would be more guidance with images and examples of, this is what we're trying to achieve. You need to work
Sure.
towards this.
It also puts it more into the process of it, whereas now stuff can kind of slip through just as the way it happens.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is something we, as part of this process, I mean, the way this is drafted would give you the ability to say yes, and you will listen to us. But that was under the assumption that there would be better, you're right, you don't have a lot of guidance right now, but that, given just my experience in this area, I know what you're trying to achieve, I think. That was part of my question of what is downtown? Where are you focused your efforts on? Because if downtown's a larger area, there's a different situation going on the kind of secondary buildings than there are on the main street.
Well, let's take this scenario and apply it to these rules. The sign that he's referencing is a really big, ugly, red and yellow sign.
Mm-hmm.
In this situation, is there anybody that would have reviewed that sign before it comes up and could have said yes or no on it?
Isn't that what the COA is? It kind of
Well-
ties to, like, we don't issue the permit without the
Yeah.
COA.
So the way this has been revamped is the design review board would say yes or no to a COA. If they say yes, they can get their zoning certificate. If they say no, they can't do the sign.
Okay. But they would have to have had to present that sign
Yes.
to somebody in the
Yes.
city, and that, we would have caught it and known before we see it up.
Yes,
Okay, that's what I wanna know.
yeah.
That's
Technically,
good,
we try to
then.
do that now, but we don't catch them, and even if we do, and they say no, he can still put that sign up, because he can go, I don't care what you say.
Well, and does that sign meet with the, I mean, I know our regulations don't apply to, how it has to be worded or color.
Right?
But I presume that it meets with the other standards in terms of size and all that.
The only thing we check now is for the total how big it can be. That's
Right.
basically it.
That's what I thought.
And one of the other things
Answer
we
your
will
question.
be delving into one way or another is whether what you allow for signage in different districts is right. And I mean, we will go through, because, there are a lot of and I think this is just a process of, they wrote their standards and they weren't really kind of thinking of the nuances, and they just said, these are the types of signs where, we just allow wall signs, which means any type of wall sign attached to the building. Whereas you can take a wall sign and that's something that's flat up against the building, or canopy. So we will be talking about the variations and, like, oh, you want to do a canopy or an awning? Well, that's fine, but you can't illuminate that, or the canopy. I've got communities talking about color who, have when it comes to signage, and particularly like awnings, which have a lot of visibility, visible coverage, will say, like, awnings have to be, one of these 8 colors or 10 colors, and it's like black with white, that kind of thing. Or, has some kind of review. So there's all kinds of iterations that I think, like I said, maybe one of the meetings when we're up here is we just delve into some of it sounds like, from what I'm gathering, is you would like more to have to say about what goes on downtown in particular. And we might have a discussion about where that's going.
Yeah.
I think we would make a mistake if we concentrate solely on the downtown business district. We certainly have homes that would meet historical criteria.
Yeah.
And we would want to see those areas protected as well.
So that was, in our previous discussion about the design review board, one of the questions I brought up was there any thought that sometime moving forward in the future, after this ordinance is adopted, that the city would want the opportunity and option to essentially establish historic districts, local historic districts, like that, for pick a residential neighborhood that you would like to see preserved in that character? Because right now you don't have any of that. And then my question was, well, your design review board is actually crafted in a way that's very similar to historic preservation commissions at other communities. So should they be that kind of historic and or design review board for these special districts? Now, I know you don't have any now, and you're not talking about kind of taking that on now, but part of the process of establishing historic districts, local historic districts, is you would establish where the boundaries of it are, but you would also establish what you're trying to preserve and what are the standards and guidelines for that, the historic standards and guidelines for that, which is then what the design review board or historic board, whatever you call it, uses to make decisions on that individual district. So like I said earlier, if there was a residential area that had a very specific type of architectural style, character, you might say in such and such district, you know, any new building's gotta be within, you know, it's gotta be constructed with that style and that characteristic. We're not saying make it look old, but we're saying you have to have that same, you know, style.
But that discussion has already started. So it's not something that somewhere down the road we're gonna be looking at. We need to be looking at that today.
So what I said I can give you is the procedures to set those up. So I will embed in this ordinance what is the procedure for establishing a local district. But it will be upon you, I don't care if you could do it the day after this is all adopted. I'm gonna give you the tools to do it. But if it takes, you know, if you do it the day after, or if it takes a year, because it does take local I mean, you know, the city, could you do it? I guess, yeah. You could establish a historic district without any property owners being on board with it, but that's not a good idea. Most local designations require, you know, at least the majority of property owners to be on board with historic designation.
I don't wanna limit it to just the downtown, because we've got, clear down on West High, we've got another, somebody took an old Pizza Hut and made it into a cannabis store, and it's yellow and green, and it's just as freaking ugly as that sign is. And, I think we need to have more control over how buildings and signs are gonna look in our whole city.
Let's do
And-
it.
And that's what I wanna see. Because
So-
I love the idea that would've caught, what you have, would've caught that sign and could've stopped it in its tracks. I want that, I don't wanna limit that to the, you know, Main Street on West High and Broadway,
Signs
or
So-
on High Street and Broadway. I want-
So this brings up the question of certificate of appropriate or not. Okay, so there's, this is a great conversation, man. I didn't know we were getting to this, but let's do it. So, the pretty picture stuff, the sign regulations and all that stuff that are gonna be in here, 100%, we could set up any of that. We can, you know, dictate that control. The question is, outside of, downtown is a very special, like, I think a special focal point, which is why communities tend to have one way or another, a historic board looking at it or a design review board. The question is, outside of that, do we need to rise to the level where we're gonna have discretionary review, which means we need to punt it to planning commission or the design review board? Or do we just, you know, have certain limitations, like, again, going back to, you know, if we're gonna get into color, you get a little discretionary, but if you're gonna say, we just don't want this type of sign anymore, that's something, again, you could just have, that's just caught at zoning certificate review. The same might apply to, one of the things we talked about is whether or not, particularly, I see this for the bigger box commercial areas, but if you're gonna have any basic architectural standards for non-residential, but not industrial, most people are like, industrial, we're not so concerned about you. But high visibility commercial areas, are we gonna talk about even the most basic, you know, and again, there are so many models out there of, that could be, it could be administrated, you know, through the zoning certificate, but like, we don't want a pole barn being the, you know, if you're gonna build a store out on the main street in the commercial area, we don't want you to just put up a basic standing seam, you know, metal building out there and call it, you know, a commercial building. We'd like a little bit more of, you know, you don't even have to get into materials, but you can limit certain things. Questions about,
I'd press okay.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
all right, Larry's not here.
Oh, no, well, no,
right.
yeah.
He's gonna
whatever.
get him. Oh, it's expired 2021, man, you're 2
Okay,
years out.
yeah. Too late.
You need to worry about it.
You know, there's, And this is where it's really just up to you. This is, I think we had a discussion about site plan review at some point, you don't have that now. There are communities that have site plan review to get some of that for, again, not for every minor building, but like if you've got a 10,000 square foot building, let planning commission look at it. Even if we have just standards, like all dumpsters have to be in the side of the rear yard, you know, some communities still want planning commission to look at that because based on the individual sites, that side yard they wanna put it in may not make sense, and so planning commission could use their power of persuasion to be like, hey, you should really, you know, we know you're required to do this and you're technically meeting the standard, but from a design standpoint, it would be better on the other side, or it would be better in the rear, why can't you work that out? And so we see, that's where you see some planning commissions getting involved with some minimal discretionary review, and where cities start to put together some basic architectural standards for just any commercial activity. And again, I'm not, these are things that would not, it's not gonna be like a super burden on the applicants, other than a little bit extra time. You know, things like, we just don't want flat roofs, you need to do something that, you know, gives it a little bit of character, use eaves, use, you know, pilasters, do something, break up the walls. If you're going to build a big, you know, Walmart-sized building, Walmart just does this now because they got tired of putting up with everybody saying, can you just, like, do something that gives it some pattern or some feel other than just one giant, huge wall. Corner buildings, having a design on the one corner that faces the other street, not just having it a big blank wall that's on the secondary street on a corner lot. All, you know, those type of things are fairly basic, you know, and, you know, again, it's not gonna, they'll tell you, oh my God, you're making us, you know, jump through hoops, but it's not really actually gonna scare anybody who really wants to be here off. So there are communities that have that. The question is, you know, is that something that you make to a point that it's clear enough that you trust staff to make the decision? Do you punt them to, I mean, you could turn the design review board into a design review board for anything where we have a question of that and not put it on planning commission. It might change the makeup of design review board, that instead of it being like a business or property owner downtown, it's gotta be a business or, you know, a business owner somewhere in the city, that kind of thing. But, yeah, it's one of those things, you have the question of what are the right standards for the city of New Philadelphia, and who's the right review board, and what's the process? And again, we don't have to call this, you know, we could call this the design review certificate, or, you know, we can play around with terms and stuff like that, and, you know, there's all kinds of little things we can do to craft this, that it achieves the goals you want, again, without trying to, you know, put a lot more work on any of the boards, or, you know, not trying to make New Philadelphia out as something you guys don't even want. But also just not try to be burdensome with, you know, meetings everywhere.
The way I look at that section of town, you know, it's the first view that people have as they're coming into our downtown. It's like that gateway, it's this like opportunity where that right now still is kind of like the Wild West. It's all kind of just whatever. And it's hard to, like, you know, I was driving down the other day, I was like, gosh, you realize that not too long from now, a good portion of these houses that are, you know, as you're going out of town, they're not gonna be there. People are buying them up, they're gonna be commercial parts, you know. I look at that and I even thought about it outside of all this, and my brain thought, oh my goodness, like, this could be something really neat. And still
Or
with
it
it,
could be more of the same thing.
or more of
which
the
we
same
don't
thing,
really
which we
want.
don't really want. And even that whole section, while there are some newer buildings that I would foresee being there for quite some time, there are a lot of those more disposable type structures where there are those pole buildings and stuff that people tend to take down, or like fast food restaurants and stuff that end up out and redone, and smaller business properties that perhaps in the next 20 years somebody will purchase as that a more higher value land and decide that that building can be something different, like tear it down completely and rebuild. So like that whole section right now is such an opportunity, and we're still ahead of it, I think, in the sense of there doesn't seem to be a whole lot that is permanently there forever. at this point. So yes, like I see that as a big opportunity for what we're doing here to impact what that could look like coming into this nice historical downtown.
So one of the other things, I mean, that's, signs will have a big impact on that. I mean, I will admit, when I first came into town for our first meeting, I stopped there and took a picture because I do a lot of sign regulations. It's one of my specialties, and one of the things, and I don't have a problem with signs, but one of the things that irks me is the feather flags. When people have like 6 of them on a really small, I'm like, why? That just drives me nuts. Like, I think, I see their use, but like, I went even by my Kroger's had a grand reopening, and they had 10 of them. And I was like, we get it. It is a grand reopening. Congratulations, you don't need 10. Now, the next time I went, it was gone, so I was happy. But I did not report them. But, you know, so there are certain things like that. But the other thing that impacts those kind of visible things are landscaping.
I was just gonna ask about landscaping because.
We will be,
Okay.
One of the things you have a little bit of discussion about, like, buffering, but one of the things some communities do is have some basic lot landscaping and street landscaping. So not necessarily that it's like a street tree or in the right of way even, it's that you have something that softens the view from the street to.
Cause that area is at huge risk for that currently. There's not a lot of.
But, you know, the funny thing is, and when,
Yeah,
you know,
natural.
sometimes I ask people this, when, you know, they talk about even residential neighborhoods and stuff like that, trying to get at, and you'll see me do this throughout this process, trying to get at what is your actual problem with certain uses. But I've worked in communities where they'll talk about, oh, you know, we like this neighborhood, which has been around from like the 70s too. We really don't like these new subdivisions, and they're all kind of designed the same, and I'm like, is it the trees? Is it the fact that they've had, you know, 40, 50 years to grow trees in their yard, and these are new homes, and they'll be like, oh, yeah. And I was like, well, part of that, I mean, not everybody wants to get into requiring that every new single family has to have 3 trees, because who wants to go out there and say, oh, you tore down your tree? But I do have communities who do that and say, you know what, I'd rather them install 3 trees, knowing that they could eventually remove them and we're not gonna get on, you know, all kinds of stuff. But
I think the big thing about West
landscaping,
High,
yeah.
it could easily just be, if it wasn't paid attention to in that scenario, it could just easily be blacktop in,
Right.
because those types of businesses most likely interested in that area at this point are going to be those types that would,
Yeah.
you know.
So, you know, I think once we get past the procedures, we're gonna start talking about uses and what uses are allowed. So that can have some impact, because certain uses have more vehicular access and drive-throughs and stuff, which has a different impact than if it's an office space. We'll talk about setbacks, which have you know, everybody talks about minimum setbacks, but there are communities that have a maximum setback to force buildings closer to the streets and push parking to the side and the rear, because especially even with speeding, if buildings, if you feel closer in, you're gonna slow down naturally, versus if you know, wide streets and wide parking areas, you feel like wide open. There's all kinds of studies on it, very cool. We'll be talking about that, but, so there's all kinds of things that we can get at. So we can get at the uses, we can get at the setbacks, we can get at landscaping, parking. Communities are starting to cap the amount of parking you can put on there. Definitely reducing the number so you don't put as much parking out there, because parking ratios are all like about like Christmas parking, and that's just usually ridiculous. We can get into architectural standards, again, you know, trying to gauge what's the right level of standards for design. Again, you know, not trying to maybe put historic level review out there, but you definitely, you know, communities very commonly have architectural standards for all their commercial activity. And then we can come back to the question of, okay, who's reviewing this? Because who's reviewing it really, in my mind, comes down to how discretionary is it. The more discretionary it is, the more I advise that you have a board with multiple eyes looking at it and multiple people trying to interpret it, versus if it's pretty objective, yes or no, I say, let staff do it, let it go quick.
Yeah, the problem, I mean, you see it when you drive into town. On the north side of West High, in particular, there are dog legs of township land. And, you know, how do you address that? I mean, there's really, I don't think a whole lot you can do about it.
You revisit it by lobbying our state legislature to not allow that anymore,
Yeah.
but that's not gonna
Yeah,
happen, I'm
that's
sorry.
not gonna
I've been here too long.
And another thing too, that I'm sure we'll address is highway signs. Those tall highway signs. We have a number of them down there.
You mean like the pole signs?
Yeah, the big pole
Yeah,
signs.
yeah.
That I would like to eliminate those altogether. And if you want to advertise that you're there, do it up on the interstate.
Well, most of them do.
Yeah, most of them do.
Yeah, I mean, so that's gonna be a fun, so again, we'll have a discussion about that. And part of that discussion is going to be, what are you trying to achieve, but what is the implications? Because that's gonna create, lowering them even 2 feet, I know you want a little more, but lowering them just 2 feet is gonna make all of them non-conforming. So then, there's a documentation to make sure that, they don't do anything to them. And that if, God forbid, some kind of weather event comes in, they go down, you don't put them back up. And so that's kind of thing, communities do it all the time, and it would take years for them to come into compliance. But I worked with North Olmsted, Ohio, on just their sign code, and I think they said it was 15 years ago, maybe. They went from like a maximum of 20 to 12 or 15. And just now, they feel like they've gotten, most of the signs are now in compliance, so it just
Yeah.
took time.
Yeah.
So what I did on this COA is just put revisit
Yes.
this. We'll come back to this after we have a discussion about the design standards. One of the things, and maybe I'll talk, is it Michael, the architect that's working
Yes,
on this
Michael
one?
McIntyre.
I might reach out to him, not just about what he's doing on, but if they're ever gonna be up here, maybe what we do is we facilitate a discussion just on design aspects to get at what do we wanna try to achieve, cause that's gonna help me write the first draft of those design standards better. Or at least closer
Right.
to where I think you are. Even if he doesn't do it, I obviously
Right.
have
Yeah,
a
yeah.
conversation, so. Okay, cause again, the COA may stay in, it may go out, we may change it, but let's revisit it after we figure out who we want to review what.
Pizza should be arriving here any time now.
Well, fortunately, I think we can get through the rest of it pretty quickly, so. The alternative equivalency review, so this is a new procedure. This is what we call the positive variance. So, we're seeing a growing number of creative applications where somebody wants to do something that is very cool, that would actually be a better option than what the city requires, but technically doesn't meet that standard. The only option they have now is to go through a variance, but the variance says you have to have a practical difficulty or some kind of unnecessary hardship. Well, there is no practical difficulty, you just wanna do something different. This allows for somebody to come, and there is a public hearing, and it would be, it'll depend on what area it is, because what this is originally drafted that if it was about the downtown design standards, it would go to the design review board. If it's about anything else, they go to planning commission for a hearing. But this is essentially where, on a case-by-case basis, they could come to the board. There would be a public hearing where adjacent property owners would be noticed, and they could propose this alternative. Examples of this, and we can limit what they can ask for. So this is just saying, for now, we're gonna let them propose alternatives to outdoor lighting, landscaping, screening, parking, and architectural standards. So an example, and I think I gave this in the code audit, is we're gonna have screening requirements that says, okay, if you got a huge parking lot, especially downtown, we want some kind of like nice fence and maybe some vegetation between that and the street. Well, what if they came and said, we got a public art idea to create a very unique public art fence or screen? And you might say, oh, that's great, but there's no practical difficulty. This would allow them to propose that in this instance, this is actually going to achieve what the city is trying to get at with screening, but they've got some different idea. This comes into play in architectural standards and downtown design review stuff when you have like materials. when you have certain limitations on materials, but then some new fancy composite comes out. I mean, the technology and materials is crazy. They could come and say, look, you know, we got something that's better. What do you think? So it's all kind of reviewed through a public hearing. It's very case by case. But the boards have to find that the boards have to find that it meets or exceeds whatever standard they're trying to do. So that's where we have to build into this ordinance the kind of legislative intent of, like, when we have screening, what are we trying to do? We're trying to screen intense vehicular use areas from the streets. We're trying to buffer more intense land uses from lower intensity, like residential. That helps build up what then the boards would be reacting to. So this is the, if you can be creative and come up with a better idea, we have a way for you to throw that out there.
That's great.
And again, this may be one that would switch depending on what we end up with design review boards and stuff like that and different design standards. But again, it is because it's a discretionary review, there is a public hearing and we would have an appropriate public hearing that. Zoning compliance review, yay. So how do we make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing? Zoning compliance review. So, what this does is we kind of have two different things happening. So there is building permits. So somebody's going to build a single family home. The zoning review is traditionally, and I think you and I talked about this, is usually done through the building permit process. Are you allowed to have a single family? Yeah, all right, that's good. Do you meet the setbacks? All right, that's good. So when there's a building permit involved, you have to do that. You have to go through, you'll get your zoning compliance review through the building permit process, and you follow that building permit process. The building permit process can't start though unless you've got all your other approvals. So if you have to go to the design review board, if you have a variance or anything like that, you get those and then it triggers the building permit. For anything else, a change of use, a change of use, change in any type of tenancy, because I think we had even talked about that. Even just to check that, people know what's going on. Certain smaller signs may not rise to the level of a building permit if they don't have electric. Anything where we call out for zoning compliance review, if they don't have if they don't need a building permit, they still have to get whatever kind of certificate you want to call it that would give them authorization to proceed.
And
I
that's
think
not currently, right?
We do have a certificate of zoning compliance for change of business tenants and things like that.
And you just wanted more,
Kind of just more laid out for them and,
Right.
Bring it more modern.
so, in what, yeah,
Technically with our building permits really aren't building permits. We don't have anybody in this area that says you can't build a house out of freaking matchsticks because we don't have anybody to enforce that.
Yeah.
All of our building permits now are technically zoning permits. We're checking setbacks, lot coverage, and that's about it. It's
Right.
not how it's built or anything.
So, and the reason why I'm not calling this a certificate of zoning compliance or whatever, you can call it whatever you want, but what this would also allow, because there's a terminology provision, would be that if you wanted to have a special sign permit or a fence permit or anything like that, that you could you could have something called a different permit or a different certificate, but this is how it is reviewed. This is the administrative procedure for it. So like I said, I see a lot of administrative permits. They're just doing a zoning check. This is just trying to lay that out.
Which is needed.
Right. So the public improvements required, this just brings into the fact that if you're gonna have to put in water or sewer across for whatever reason, where it would rise to level being part of the public system, you have to do that before you get your compliance review. Administrative waiver request. So this is one we had talked about as part of the code audit. What this is doing is for any area or dimensional variance, like a setback, this would give the code administrator the authorization to approve it. It would have to still meet all of the standards of a variance. There has to be some kind of practical difficulty, or something along that line. And so that's something that you wouldn't have to go to the BZA for every little thing. This has been particularly beneficial for small things like somebody's got an unusual lot shape that, and their building's gonna just clip into it like 6 inches, but the setback, 6 inches into a 10-foot setback or something. This would prevent them from having to go up to the BZA. One of the things we didn't really talk about is I started off at 10% because that's pretty minor. Some communities go up to 20%, but that kind of depends on how comfortable you feel with it. You might start at 10 and maybe if that's going well, go to 20. Other communities would just, again, kind of look at what is the most commonly kind of approved variance that seems to be working and kind of look at it in that standpoint. So, any thoughts on this? 10%, 20%, don't want to do it?
I'm for doing it if it's a small, because if it's, I don't know, 20% to me is enough to where I think the board needs to look at it, but if it's something where there's a 5-foot setback and they're 6 inches over, I think administratively we should be able to do that, but that's just my opinion. But if it's a 5-foot setback and they wanna be only 3 feet off, that's, to me, is, you need to notify the neighbors and get the board involved and all that kind of stuff.
So our setbacks still 5 feet on the sides?
Depends on the zones, but residential 5 feet off the rear and side,
See,
unless you're on an alley.
That's always kind of bugged me, because over the years, like, I compare them to Dover, but Dover's 7.5 on the sides.
Ours are tight, especially when you get in the alleys.
I've never liked that. I think if we could move it out to 7.5 or 8 or whatever, because usually what happens, they lay the house out, get the basement laid up, and then start the structure, and the base is 5 foot, but the overhang is a foot.
Technically, our code says any part of the structure is supposed to be at that, but it was never enforced over the last decades. So
Right.
that's why. Or
I
stuff
think
that
that's
just-
why Dover went 7.5, so if that did happen, there's still gonna be 5 or 6.
She talked about totally, when we redistrict and rezone, look at some of the lots that we currently have and alter the setbacks to, St. Clair where the lots are all small
Right.
compared to Lakeview and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things I'm gonna try to be working on next is, we had talked about splitting up into instead of one residential district, there would be a number of them. Whatever the one that's gonna be kind of for new development, it's gonna be pretty easy enough, because anything new, this is our standard that we really want moving forward. But when you talk about the older neighborhoods, we're gonna look at what's more on the ground, and typically it's the setback to whatever the structure is. Because again, it goes back to the number of nonconformities, and if that is so prevalent across a lot of neighborhoods, then it makes sense to just leave it be, and that's just what you're going to deal with. And instead of saying for the occasional tear down and rebuild, this is gonna be the standard, so. I think that is one of the benefits we'll have when we go to multiple residential districts is we can tailor it a little bit to what's on the ground, but also be aware of what you want in the future.
Is there something in there that spells out to the setback? Because we've seen it kind of before, the one where they did the setback off of the asphalt, not property line or the road right-of-way line.
I think ours says property line.
Well,
It's
it
supposed to
does,
be.
but I don't know if there's something in there that kind of spells that, so they think about that.
So there will be. There will be lots of graphics too that say lot line.
Because a lot of cities will use from the center of the roadway too, and I don't like that with our,
Yeah.
we like, I think property lines fit our city better
Yeah.
instead of center of roadway.
Back
Yeah.
to sidewalk.
Right.
Right away is back to sidewalk, and.
Right.
How
Which some of where I'm referring to don't have sidewalks. It's a 50-foot wide, you've got the asphalt that goes down through there that's, 20, 30, whatever. But you got the space over there for the sidewalk, but when they did the setback for the garage, to keep their 20 feet off, they went from the asphalt, so now,
How frequent does this happen, though? I'm just curious, because some of it, especially with existing old issues, and then new possibilities, like maybe in this sense, somebody more involved should look at it each time until it's more under control, is what I'm wondering.
Setbacks with stuff now or every week up there, usually if someone's adding a shed or a garage or a pool or a fence.
Okay.
Which I don't like our fences being allowed to go right up to the property line. I don't like that at all, cause then you got two that'll come right up to each other and you got grass growing up in between or whatever, but.
I was
usually
just
with-
curious, like,
usually with
how
accessory
frequent
structures.
would you be okay with somebody administratively
Oh, the minor
just,
like the
yes,
minor approval.
the minor approval part?
I mean, they're fairly common with, you know, if it's a 5-foot setback and someone wants to go, everybody's trying to squeeze it out to the very limit. I'd say that's-
But how many of them would meet the
So
qualification of, no, qualification of the variance, where there's some kind of practical difficulty? Cause this is not just, this is not giving you the ability to just say, yeah, it's fine, it's small.
Right. I don't think that's looked at like it should be, no.
Well, so this is still saying you have to show some kind of practical difficulty. This is not giving a free-for-all 10% waiver on
Okay.
every area dimensional variance.
A lot of the board of zoning, yeah, it doesn't, it needs to be, I think that process needs to be spelled out better too than what we have currently. That would-
Well, so some of that is and well, we got to appeals here, and we talked about variances and conditional uses earlier, but, I mean, the review criteria of what a variance, you know, has to meet, the practical difficulty, and, you know, basically, it's not something that, you know, they're just asking for. That is spelled out better in here with the review criteria, but these administrative waivers, it's cross-referencing that you are considering the area dimensional thing, so you, as if you're the code administrator, are gonna have to say, yeah, this is an unusual situation, like I said, the lot's not perfectly square like everything else, and it's, you know, but to have a traditional house the same, like if the house is the same as everything and they wanna do kind of the same as everything, but it's gonna clip in, okay, that's practical difficulty. But if it's just, well, you're requiring us to be 5 feet and we really wanna be 4, or, you know, whatever.
So a lot of times on zoning boards of appeals, we look at what's contiguous. There's 4 houses in a block, 3 of them have a porch, and the steps are dumped right out onto the sidewalk. Well, this guy doesn't have a porch, so he wants to build one just like the other 3, and none of them meet the setbacks. So, I mean, typically we would say, yeah, everybody else has it, you can do it too. So you're saying that should probably go away.
That's where the code hurts us, I think, because you're creating more nonconformities down the line.
One of the benefits of.
And that's just like in the older parts of town with tiny lots. I don't think there should be any variances ever for the new construction. It's like build what you're gonna build to match the.
You still have weird lot shapes, you know, like, just, again, because topography and streams can kind of make for quirky situations. So there's legitimately always a reason to, you know, have the variance procedure. What you're talking about where, like, you're dealing with standards that apply to older neighborhoods that aren't working, we're gonna try to fix that a couple of ways. One is when we create these new broader range of zoning districts, residential zoning districts, as an example, one of the things I'm gonna look at is what is the typical setback that applies in these areas, and apply them. So, you know, if it's 20 feet now, but everybody's 10, we're gonna make it 10. So that wipes out a whole bunch of them. The other thing is, and this is also kind of an answer to some of your questions, is where the section is that we're gonna talk about what are the setback requirements and, you know, front yard, rear yard. Lots of graphics. I have routinely now in recent years done 2 graphics for every type of lot. So an interior lot, which is, you know, 2 sides and a rear and a front. I show you where is the front yard setback applied, where's the side yard setback applied, where's the rear yard setback applied, and then what are the yards? So the rear yard is everything to the rear of the back, you know, that kind of thing. Same with corner lots, same with double lots. So there's a lot more graphics and definition of just what is a yard, where are we measuring from. In fact, every type of lot requirement we have, there's some kind of definition of the measurement. How do we measure building height? to your point, the other thing that I usually include is, especially on front yard setbacks, because that's where we see a lot of the porches and that kind of thing, is I usually have a averaging ability, like an averaging standard that said where the average of either the same block face, so everything on that same side of the block from one street to the other, you average that out, that's what your setbacks can be. So if everybody's at 10 feet with their porch, you can have a porch at 10 feet. And if everybody's house is at 50, that kind of thing. Or some communities do it by, the closest 4 lots. If you're the corner lot, it's the next 3 over, every variation of that. Some people do it in distance. There's all kinds of takes on that, but that should take some of that out of your realm. Because again, what variances really should be is something odd is happening, not just somebody's asking for it. If somebody's asking for it and it just makes sense, and you keep getting asked for that, that's where you should be making a change in the code. Especially if it's constantly getting approved. I'm trying to make it easier for the boards. So 10% sound like a good starting point?
Josh?
I think so. I mean, I'd like to hear what Ron has to say too, but I wouldn't want anything to, like I said, I wouldn't feel comfortable with 25% or anything crazy like that without a board reviewing it.
So, I think up here too, one of the things we allowed, let's see, sometimes I allow, it to be, if you want to punt it up to the BZA, like if you're uncomfortable with it, I may, make.
If it's 3 inches over the property line, we don't have to have the board appear for a meeting just for, all right, it's good, and then we're all out of here within a minute,
Yeah. But then also, one of the other things I wanted to point out, and one, you can just try it at 10%, and if it works, and then people are, and people aren't trying to pull we just want it, then you can always reassess later on, and it's easier to increase it later than to take it back. One of the other things about what should and shouldn't you be doing as a board, decision making, some of that's just like training.
Mm-hmm.
And I just saw on June 30th, I think up in Kent, they're having a planning and zoning workshop where they invite elected and citizen planning officials. They do training, and some of them have training on what should I be doing as a board of zoning, but what should I be looking at and what shouldn't I be doing as a board of zoning appeals. So some of that is just learning the kind of ins and outs of what your role is on those boards. Appeals, I think we're almost there. Yeah, woo! We're gonna get through this. So appeals, you guys follow along with most the other processes and what they could do. So appeals are, so even with that kind of decision you have on the administrative waiver, if you say no, they can appeal it and go to BZA. So in some, one way or another, the BZA could still hear it. I didn't really make any structural changes to the actual process. The one question I have is that right now, I actually had to read it twice to make sure I was reading it right. Right now you say that somebody has up to 60 days to appeal, which is one of the longest timeframes I've ever seen anybody give anybody to appeal. Most communities are 20 to 30 days to appeal. And part of that is because that 60 days, institutes so nobody's doing anything for 60 days. You can't authorize anybody to proceed, that kind of thing. And so 60 days is pretty extensive. I threw in 30 just to cut it in half. But some communities will only give somebody up to 20 days to appeal it. If you aren't so upset about the decision that you need 60 days or 30 days to sit on it, then,
What about 10 days?
I was gonna say, the least amount, the better, I feel like.
I don't know of any problem with 10 days. I don't know if I've ever really seen it that short. Like I said, typically I see it at 20. I mean, I can tentatively put 10 in there, and I don't know,
I just threw that out there for discussion.
I don't know, legally,
Well, I mean, if somebody's on vacation or something.
Yeah.
it's gotta
Well,
make
that's
it-
just the time to appeal, that doesn't mean you have to have the meeting to
Right.
hold the
This is
hearing.
just the time frame for when a decision is made to when they can say to the BZA, I wanna appeal the decision.
Yeah.
Our housing code's 10 and our international property maintenance code's 20 right now.
Split the difference, 15?
Make them
I'm
all
just-
different.
I'm just throwing that,
Yeah.
I'd like to see everything the same, I'm
Which
just throwing
one
out
is
the
it?
numbers we got. As long as it's, you know, cause Board of Zoning Appeals meets second Tuesday of every month right
Yeah.
now. So as long as we've got the date for the guy to appeal, and then we've got the date, you know, that meeting will be
So,
held
yeah.
within so many, the hearing will be held within so many.
Yeah, and I don't, again, I'm not, you could say 10, and I'm here for you, but, so the first headline where you have 60, and I was like, whoa, and I dropped it to 30, that is just the time frame from when the decision is made to when they file an appeal. So they file the appeal, and then we say, within 45 days of that filing is when the hearing is. And the reason I always use 45 days is, you know, if you're doing it the second Tuesday or whatever, then it, you know, you could have a long day, or, you know, you might have to set up a special hearing because of quorum, you know, it just gives you a little bit of flexibility, so.
The one thing said something about the unhappy neighbor appealing, I don't think I've ever seen that. Are you saying once somebody starts a project that the Board of Appeals says you can start, that their neighbor can come in and object and?
If the neighbor, let's say they, especially with the administrative waiver, but let's say that somebody authorized something to go forward, you authorize somebody to go forward. The neighbor could be just spiteful, you don't see it happen very often, but unfortunately it does happen. They could, in theory, in 60 days, say, no, I think that decision was wrong. Now, it's probably just, they're just unhappy, but if they wanna file the appeal, they can.
I didn't know that was a possibility. I don't think we've ever had that happen, so.
I think any variance with setbacks and stuff, the contiguous neighbors are supposed to be notified that way. They can come in and say, no, I don't want it closer to my property line, but whether, I don't know if our office always notifies all the contiguous neighbors about, cause it's very rare that the neighbors come in.
Yeah, several times we've had them come in with a letter that says it's okay with my neighbor.
Right, and I recommend that to them, if they're like, oh, my neighbors are fine with that, so get that in writing, it'll help you with the board.
Well, one way or another, I mean, it is rare, but even then, 60 days is a long time to be, you know, and
Oh, yeah.
part of it is, you know, part of it is, you know, we also have shorter time frames for even getting things rolling with the zoning compliance review, so. You wanna just do 20 then? That's the,
I wouldn't wanna go more than 20, I would just say.
Yeah, I wouldn't wanna go more than 20.
alright,
20's good.
Cause that's,
20's
they're getting
good.
notified right then and there, we either call them or we're in
Yeah.
person saying that's denied. So
Yeah.
they've got, it's not like there's a big lag of days going in between
Yeah.
where they
Yeah,
don't have enough
Apple Pay.
time to make a decision.
yeah, I mean, appeal, the process itself is common, it's what I've seen across most communities, so it's, you weren't off on that, and I think that's because appeals processes doesn't really change. That 60 days is the only thing I was like, and that's it for the appeals. The only other thing we have in here is the interpretation of code, and I always like to add this in here. We always put, I always suggest the first line of interpretation of can I do this or can I not is with the code administrator. If you don't like that decision, you go up to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So if there's a question about, if you were to say, no, I don't think that boundary of the zoning district falls there, they would go to the that pumps them to the Board of Zoning Appeals, so. It's just, you know, instead of, some communities do put the Board of Zoning Appeals, like any question of interpretation has to go to them. That's just like, I mean, why make it go to a board unless, you know, it's an obvious error? That's
Where-
it.
Where does it go, for an appeal of the BZA?
Goes to the county court. County police. And that's where, and there's a very prescribed procedure for that in the state statutes that we reference in here. We just say you follow this. that's where it's always good training, to have a good record, particularly the BZA, to have a good record of like what the action and decision was and why you made that decision. Because the court will look at the record, and as I mentioned earlier, they will give deference to the city. So if you just said, we denied it, crickets, the court could reopen the case. Versus if you're like, we denied this because they didn't meet X standard, Y standard, and Z standard, the judge will look at that and say, well, no, you made, you asked the questions, they didn't meet it, you said they don't meet it, we denied it, the decision carries. All right, that's all the procedures, we got through it. Like I made a note that we will revisit the COA
Yes.
after we talk about the design standards, because again, it could be you keep that, it could be we change that into some variation, it could be we just incorporate that into something else. That's one of the great things about this, and I guess why I love doing this, is there's just so many different things you can do, and it's all about just figuring out what works best for you. And it might be we are writing some new process that only happens in New Philadelphia, and that's fine as well.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Like I did last time, I will work with the mayor on scheduling another meeting, and like I said, I'll talk to Michael, and if it works out that maybe we can do something, jointly about the plan and what we want to do with these design standards, maybe we'll jump and do that first. But otherwise, one of the things I've been working on, and this is gonna be another fun discussion, is the zoning districts. What do those new zoning districts look like? What are the setbacks gonna be for them? And what are the principal uses that are gonna be allowed on them? So, look for that in the coming weeks, and we'll work on another meeting.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Wendy.
Yeah.
There's pizza back there, one side.